just watched the last video, your mind might be a little bit boggling right now with all of the algebra that we did with completing the square. So basically what I'm doing in this video is to give you a summary of how to complete the square, and I'm going to use a generic example, ax squared plus bx plus c, to actually derive something totally different, which leads into the next video. Okay, so let me just quickly recap on all the steps that we went through to complete the square. Okay, so you've probably been wanting to know this. Alright, step one is you make the leading term 1x squared. Okay, so let's do that with this particular example. You have to divide everything by a squared, by a, alright? So you've got 1x squared plus b over ax plus c over a equals to 0. The next thing you have to do is step 2, bring the constant to the right hand side. What is the constant? The constant is the term without an x in it. There's no x's in it. This is the only term without an x in it. Bring that over to the other side. So that becomes 1x squared plus b over ax equals to, well, I might bring the equal sign over here, equals to minus c over a. Alright, the next thing we have to do is complete the square. Alright, how do we complete the square? If you remember from a perfect square, you take the x term, not the x squared term or the constant term, you take the x term and then you halve, square and add it to the left hand side, and you've got to balance it up on the right hand side by adding the same thing. So, alright, so halve, square, add and balance. So let's halve this. So halve b on a, and that becomes b on 2a, and then you square it and you add it on to the left hand side and you balance it up by adding it on to the right hand side. Does that make sense? Now the next thing you do is you make this side a perfect square. So if you make this a perfect square, see how this mirrors that, or this mirrors that? To make that a perfect square, all you need to know is what your x is, which is just x, and what your a is. And your a is going to be the b on 2a. So in other words, x is going to be equal to, so x plus b on 2a, all squared, is going to be what this is equal to. Yes? And that is going to be equal to whatever that is when you work that out algebraically. Alright? So that's going to be minus c on a plus b squared on 4a squared. Multiply a squared to both sides, so it's b squared on 4a squared. So bring that over to this side, that goes here, and bring that over to this side, and it should be minus 4a squared 4ac, and then that is equal to b squared minus 4ac all on 4a squared. So the perfect square is equal to that, okay, that monstrosity of an algebraic term. And then the next step, step 5, is to undo the square. We undo the square, and by undoing the square we've got to take the positive and negative cases for the right hand side. So in other words, x plus b on 2a is going to be equal to, take the square root of that, 4a squared, and that's 2a, and the rest of it is plus minus b squared minus 4ac. Now, you're probably starting to see take shape something that you may or may not have seen in the past. Some of you might be familiar with it. Yes, we're getting inching and closer towards the quadratic formula, which is basically the fourth and final technique that allows us to solve quadratic equations. And so the only step that remains is to bring this term over to the right hand side. X is equal to minus b, and it's all over 2a plus minus square root of b squared minus 4ac. Yep. And so by completing the square for a generic quadratic formula, we end up with this formula. And that formula is what we can use to work out any sort of root for any sort of quadratic that we might have. That is, assuming it has real roots, and I'll talk about that in a second. So the steps that you need to do to complete the square is make x squared the leading term, bring the constant to the right hand side, complete the square by halving, squaring, and adding the 2ax term, okay, and then balancing it off on the right hand side by adding the same thing on the right hand side, turning everything into a perfect square, undoing the square, and then solving. Okay. Alright, well, in the next episode we'll be going through how to use the quadratic formula, and we'll be going through some of the significance of it. Thank you very much for watching.